Hola, muy buenas tardes y bienvenidos a esta nueva sesión de Casa Mediterráneo. Muchas gracias, como siempre, a quienes nos siguen desde sus casas. Hoy, en la sesión Gastronomía y el Mediterráneo, contamos con un invitado muy especial, Tristram Stuart. Stuart es el autor del libro Despilfarro, el escándalo global de la comida. Es también conferenciante, activista y experto en el impacto ambiental y social de los alimentos. Ha sido galardonado a nivel internacional y sus libros han sido descritos por el diario The Times como una contribución realmente reveladora a la historia de las ideas. Su charla en la plataforma TED se ha visto más de 1 millón de veces. La organización de campañas ambientales que fundó, Feedback, ha extendido su trabajo a decenas de países en todo el mundo para cambiar la actitud de la sociedad hacia el despilfarro de alimentos. Hoy, Tristram nos atiende desde Londres. Tristram, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
How would you describe yourself?
I am, well, first and foremost, an environmental activist, but that activism has taken many different forms. I set up a campaigning charity, Feedback, like you mentioned. I'm also an author of books. I'm an entrepreneur. I set up a business that supports the charity, but it is a business, the one that brews beer. And also most recently, and perhaps quite fun, is that I can now add farmer to the list of my vocations. I recently acquired a small herd of cattle that do conservation grazing in the natural area where I live.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What is the difference between food loss and food waste?
Well, those terms are used to help people understand that there are kind of two main areas of waste. On the one hand, there's what typically you might think of when you think of food waste, all of that food that is thrown away in people's homes, in supermarkets, in restaurants, in factories, and it is kind of deliberate and as a result of the profligate wastage of perfectly good food. And that's a problem that is very much associated with relatively privileged countries and privileged sectors of the population. And food loss refers to the kind of accidental waste of food, particularly at the farm level, where crops might, for example, in African countries, in some parts of the global south, where there is just not sufficient investment in on-farm infrastructure to prevent crops from going moldy and rotting before they get to market. So grain stored in grain stores that allow moisture in and insects in, and they get eaten or go moldy before they can be eaten, or fruit that gets bruised on the way to market because people simply don't have fruit crates to get it, or cold chain to get food to market on time. Now, of course, these are not black and white issues, and a lot of food that happens on farms these days actually can be attributed to deliberate policies of, say, supermarkets that treat their farmers badly and cause them to waste food on farms. So it is, as long as we understand these are blurry categories, they can be useful to understand very different sources of the waste of food.
So your message is quite simple. You say that surely there is something more sensible to do with food than waste it. Is that right?
Well, yes, it goes a bit deeper than that too. Food, as we know, is the single biggest negative impact that humans have on planet Earth. It's by far the biggest cause of deforestation. It's the single biggest source of carbon dioxide emissions. It's the main cause of soil erosion. It's by far the biggest user of fresh water. And it is essentially the main reason why we are in the middle of the mass species extinction event that we're in. And the fact that 1/3 of all of that production and all that environmental cost is done to grow food that no one then eats, it's an obvious absurdity and a huge opportunity as well to reduce our environmental impact, as well as increasing food availability where it's most needed. But there's another step beyond that, which I really want to put in the foreground, and that is that campaigning on food waste is a very effective way of revealing and demonstrating the hypocrisy at the heart of the food paradigm that dominates the food system today. And that paradigm is what I call the productionist paradigm. The idea, the argument that we hear big corporations spin out the whole time, that what we need in the 21st century is to double food production by 2050, or increase it by 50, 60, 70% in order to stave off a mass famine of billions of people by mid-century. That idea that we need to double food production to solve the existing food problems is both a really bad strategy. I mean, literally, if we do that, we will cook the planet and render it possibly unable to provide food in the long term. But it's also a strategy that is based on, like I said, a hypocrisy. We do not need to double food production by 2050, globally speaking. And this has more to do with the interests of large corporations than to do with the actual nutritional needs of the human population. And food waste, the fact that we currently waste a third of the world's food, is a very easy, clear way that everyone can understand to demonstrate that actually our problem lies elsewhere. It's to do with distribution, it's to do with sensible use of resources. The first thing we need to do is stop wasting so much food, stop eating too much in over-consuming countries, and particularly stop eating too much of the very resource-intensive foods like meat and dairy products.
You have stressed that globally food is being wasted at a colossal scale. What are some of the numbers we're talking about? Do you think people are aware of the magnitude of the problem?
Well, compared to 20 years ago, people are so much more aware of the scale of the problem. And indeed, in many countries, there have been very substantial inroads into solving this problem. Let me just take you back 20 years to when I first started publicly campaigning on the issue of food waste. Literally, public awareness was at a zero level. The media attention to this issue was pretty much non-existent. Government investment in solving the problem, almost non-existent. Big corporations never talked about food waste. They were brushing it under the carpet. And that has all completely changed. People are much more aware now. You cannot be a big food corporation without having a food waste strategy. Governments around the world have invested millions and millions of pounds into public awareness, into convincing big businesses to stop wasting food. There are now dozens and dozens of really successful businesses, both in Spain, in Latin America, but around the world, in Europe and North America, that are absolutely dedicated, startups that are dedicated to tackling food waste, whether it's selling ugly vegetables or helping restaurants cut their food waste, or helping people to share food that they no longer want but they can give to their neighbors. This is a massive industry now, and it's completely transformed the situation. We've seen in countries like the United Kingdom that per capita there has been a reduction of 1/3 of all the food being wasted in homes. And that is a massive achievement. It's very difficult to find big environmental mass behavior change successes on that scale anywhere in the world. And so I'd say that the food waste problem, while still massive, is the awareness is so much greater. Do we have more work to do? Oh my goodness, yes we do. We have a United Nations Sustainable Development Goal that all countries in the world have signed up to. And one of those goals, of which I am an official UN champion, is to halve food waste by 2030. Here in the United Kingdom, we are halfway to that target, and most other countries, well, all other countries are behind us on that trajectory. So we do need to get the message out that this is something that has to stop. It's maladaptive, it's environmentally destructive, it's socially irresponsible, and we can all save money as well as resources by just making sure that we eat food rather than throwing it away.
Before we go on, where would you say your interest in food, food systems and food waste in particular come from?
Well, I suppose strategically, as an environmentalist, one wants to find where are the issues that one can make the biggest difference in the shortest space of time. We're in a total crisis at the moment on planet Earth, and we all need to do whatever we can. And I identified food waste as one of those issues that was relatively easy to solve, but with huge impacts. And indeed, the Paul Hawken Drawdown Project has identified food waste reduction as among the top 3 environmental initiatives for reducing carbon dioxide emissions. And this is backed up by a McKinsey report that identified food waste as one of the top 3 resource efficiency opportunities in the world, and numerous other studies. So it is a a low-hanging fruit, as we call it. I also, and biographically, I have a kind of a personal investment in this issue. I actually live on a small farm in the countryside in England. I live where I grew up. When I was a teenager, I started to breed pigs and chickens, and I stopped wanting to buy animal feed. It's very expensive, and I already knew that soy in Latin America was creating a massive environmental problem, the deforestation there and the ploughing up of the Cerrado. And so I started to do what traditionally was done with pigs and chickens, and that is feeding them on food waste. I went to the school kitchens where I was at school, and collected all of the waste from their kitchens. Went to the local baker and collected the leftover bread, the local greengrocer. I was even picking up misshapen or oversized potatoes from a farmer who couldn't sell them to supermarkets because they were the wrong shape or size. That was great. I got lots of free food for my animals and turned it into pork and eggs, and then sold those farm products to my school friends' parents, and gained the title Farmer Stuart and got lots of pocket money that way. But at the same time, I was absolutely appalled by the quantity of food that I was seeing being wasted, and the quality. It was better than a lot of the food that I was eating with my dad at home. Indeed, I started to eat the bread from the organic bakery that I was picking up for my pigs. It was better than the supermarket bread my dad was buying. And that really became a way for me to understand the scale of the problem. I was like using a teaspoon to dig away at a mountain. And I thought, we've got to do something about this massive environmental and social calamity.
Let's go to your book now, where you describe food waste as a global scandal. What does it show? What were some of your main findings?
Well, that was the first attempt to bring together a global assessment of the problem of food waste, to look both at the economic, the sociological, the political, the anthropological, and the historical reasons for food waste. So to really contextualize, where was the waste happening? Why was it happening? And then in the final part of the book, of course, the most important bit, what can we do to solve this? And I look at behavior change. Obviously, we citizens are responsible for a very large part of the food waste. What can we be doing about it? I have a lot to say in there about supermarkets, because supermarkets I identified as the single most powerful unit within the food system. And I see much of the food waste that is caused in people's homes and upstream on farms and in factories as caused by the policies of the big supermarkets. These are very powerful entities within the food chain. There's typically in Western countries a small number of very large food retailers who dominate 80 or even more than 90% of the grocery market. And this gives them disproportionate power with regard to their suppliers, the farmers and their factories, and also huge power over the customers that go to their stores every day. So they encourage people to buy more food than they need. Their marketing policies are incredibly powerful. They've invested millions of dollars in trying to find out how to trigger our impulse to buy more food. And that is one of the reasons why week after week after week, we spend our hard-earned money at the till of supermarkets to buy food that we then throw into the trash. And I looked very closely at the policies that supermarkets have with farmers and with factories that result in huge amounts of waste at the supply chain level. And then, of course, at the waste of supermarkets themselves. So I have a lot to say about that. And then most of the book is about how we reduce the food waste in the first place. And then I've got a large section on, okay, so some waste is always going to arise. What's the next best thing to do with it? Is it energy production? Is it composting? And I have a very big section championing pigs and chickens as actually the best way of using food that can no longer be used for human consumption. It's the most environmentally friendly and economically beneficial way of upcycling food that would otherwise be wasted. Humans devised this way of upcycling thousands of years ago when we first domesticated those animals. And I have a lot to say about the European law that currently prevents the feeding of food waste to pigs and chickens, which I say is the most scientifically unjustified, environmentally destructive piece of legislation in Europe. And that's really saying something. And then I round it off with a bit of optimism. I look at parts of the world where real progress has been made as a result of both citizen action, but also government policy and business entrepreneurialism to try and tackle that problem.
Thanks for this overview. You have seen discarded food all over the world. Could you please give us some examples of the most striking things, or some of the most striking things that you have witnessed in your travels?
Sure. In fact, every time I do an investigation into this, I get shocked anew, but I can share some anecdotes. I visited many countries in the global south that are producing food for North America and Western Europe. So, for example, in Peru, I went up and down the western coast of Peru looking at where farmers are growing asparagus for North America and Western Europe, tangelos, so different citrus fruits and other fruits and vegetables. And I found, for example, a farmer who was just in the process of burying 1,000 tons of tangelos in the desert, where those fruits were going to just rot and become methane that was going to pollute the atmosphere even more. He had invested thousands and thousands of dollars into growing this food, but he couldn't sell it to the UK supermarket that he was supposed to be selling to, Morrison's, because they were a couple of millimeters too small, some of them, and others had just really superficial skin blemishes. And they were perfectly good fruit, but because of those completely arbitrary and totally unnecessary cosmetic standards, he literally had nowhere else that he could sell them, and his only option was to waste food. And this is in a country, Peru, where hundreds of thousands of children don't have enough to eat. And that juxtaposition of the use of resources in a country that is struggling to feed itself to grow food for rich, fussy, exploitative Western supermarkets, and have the environmental impact and the use of that land that could have been used to grow food for people locally. That kind of scandal is among the most shocking, where you get that stacked up environmental and social, really outrageous situation. I mean, the Western Peru, they're drilling deep boreholes to get to the fresh water, and those are going deeper and deeper. And there's not enough water there. People are now talking about drilling a hole through the Andes Mountains to replumb the Amazon basin and bring water from one side of the Andes to the other. And that's all amazing stuff. And there are people who are turning the desert green. It's incredible. But then to waste 30% of the produce, asparagus that are too fat or too thin or too curvy and bendy, perfectly good for human consumption, but thrown away because they don't look perfect. That is really bonkers behavior. I did similar work in, for example, Kenya, where I visited 4 or 5 times and found smallholder farmers who are wasting routinely 50% of their peas and beans that they were growing for Western supermarkets. Very often they were being made to waste 100% of any individual harvest because supermarkets would cancel an order at the last minute because they had found cheaper beans from Guatemala that year or somewhere else, or local producers were producing enough, or because consumers weren't eating so much because the weather had changed in Europe, or any number of different reasons. And it was always the farmers at the very, very bottom of our power base, the people being paid less than $2 a day, who would have to bear the cost of this unpredictable market. the people least able to bear that risk were being made to take the whole of that risk. And I think I've never felt as ashamed of being a European as I have when I've faced farmers who have gone into debt to grow beans for supermarkets in my country and then not being paid for the crop. We have a word for when we make people work for no money, and we have a history of doing that in Africa. It's not a pretty historical context when you look at it, and it's really, really shocking.
So where does all this food end up?
Well, in the cases that I've just mentioned, it's quite literally being wasted. In Kenya, there's so much of this waste that quite a thriving dairy industry has arisen around Nairobi, using up all the kind of discards from the export hubs near the airport in Nairobi. But that's not an optimal use for a high quality, high resource intensive horticultural product like a fine bean. To feed it to cows, I mean, you can feed grass to cows. You don't need to feed these, very, very valuable vegetables to cows. But that's only in the best case scenario. Much of it, I mean, literally sits in the African heat and rots and goes moldy. And farmers will get a telephone call to come and get it if they want it, to sell it to somebody else. But if anyone's ever been to Nairobi, they know that the traffic there is so bad that by the time any farmer gets that call, it's 7 hours back in the traffic, using up diesel. It's totally unviable. So it literally just sits there and rots. It's a real scandal, or sometimes doesn't even get harvested. I met farmers who were destroying harvests that they had grown because there was no longer a market for it. Of course, where possible, any producer will find what we call a secondary market for their product. Either they will be able to sell their produce locally to local people and get at least something for that, or they can sell their food to processors who can, for example, turn an avocado into guacamole. And in some supply chains that are well developed, those secondary markets are exploited to the full. So an avocado grower in Latin America, usually, even if they're growing for export, will find secondary markets for reject avocados. Local people eat an awful lot of them. And of course, anything that's maybe blemished or the wrong shape or size can go into processing for guacamole or whatever. So in that particular sector, the waste is nothing like as large. In the banana supply chain, so I visited banana plantations in Ecuador, in Colombia and other countries. And there, of course, there's a whole industry of reclaiming those reject bananas and selling where possible locally, and failing that to take it off to pigs. But again, one sees mountains of perfectly good bananas being fed to pigs or being left to rot. And that's the kind of thing you just think, oh my God, if you think about the chemicals being used, the water being used, the fact that forests, tropical rainforests being chopped down to grow bananas for Western countries that then end up being left to rot or being fed to pigs, it's just totally ridiculous and scandalous. And I'm pleased to say that while still a massive problem, we have made significant inroads into at least some of that trading behavior that results in that kind of waste.
You have mentioned the cosmetic standards that exist in the food industry and market. How bad is this problem?
Well, it is a huge problem. If you are a grower of fruit and vegetables, you might typically, if you're supplying supermarkets, expect to waste 20, 30, even 40 or 50% of your produce because it doesn't meet the cosmetic standards of the supermarkets. Now, if those cosmetic standards were a real thing, namely that consumers simply won't buy food if it doesn't comply with those cosmetic standards, then you could begin to understand that this is kind of a necessary and almost natural boundary to production. But my research has demonstrated conclusively that that is not in fact the case. Customers will buy that reject produce, and that has been proven because the whole point is that whenever supply is short, so let's say the Guatemalans didn't have a good year for green beans, or the Ecuadorians didn't have a good year for bananas, or indeed in Britain, the potato farmers didn't have a good year for potatoes. This happened in 2007, 2008. We lost nearly 40% of our potato harvest. Did we have to import any extra potatoes? No, we didn't. We just allowed onto the supermarket shelves, by relaxing the cosmetic standards for that year, all the potatoes that would normally be rejected and left to rot or be fed to animals. Did consumers stop buying potatoes? Did they buy any fewer potatoes? No, they didn't. They carried on buying them. No one even noticed that the cosmetic standards have been lowered. The fact is that those cosmetic standards are imposed by supermarkets partly to guarantee that if in a scarce year they still need more potatoes, they can still get plenty of potatoes. It's like they create artificial surplus, because that is what a buyer's market wants. They want loads of potatoes everywhere so they can always buy them cheap. And time and again, you see that when supply is down and demand is up, those cosmetic standards get chucked out the window. It's just a way of controlling, so that when supply is high, they can say, oh, no, we're not going to pay you because your produce doesn't meet this cosmetic standard. It has very little to do with fussy consumers and more to do with the financial interests of the supermarkets.
Now, talking about consumers, you say that we, the people, do have the power to stop this tragic waste of resources. I would like to ask you, how do you believe that it can happen now? What is the best thing to do with food waste?
I should just frame the answer to this question, which I hope won't be too lengthy, but just to say at the beginning, I am one of the deepest, darkest pessimists I know. I think it is becoming increasingly unlikely, if you look at the trajectories globally, unfortunately, that we are going to put a stop to this environmental calamity that we're in the middle of. All the trajectory is going in the wrong direction. We're still accelerating in many ways in the wrong direction. Deforestation continues, carbon dioxide emissions continue to go up. Species extinction, in my lifetime, we've eliminated more than half of wildlife on planet Earth. It's really very, very, very bleak indeed. Probably by the end of the century, most of the species that share this planet with us will have been made to go extinct through our actions. However, I do believe that we still have a chance. And whilst not optimistic, I hold on to hope. I believe that we could be on the brink of a global tipping point that creates a transformation in the economy and in our society. Indeed, I see signs of that everywhere. I used to see little islands of hope popping up in the ocean of hopelessness. And now I believe that underneath those islands is a continent waiting to emerge. I see businesses, individuals, companies, governments doing huge amounts to try to turn this massive Titanic around. And so it is within that context of really being on the brink of the precipice that I would urge everyone to wake up to the urgency of the environmental and social calamity that we are really looking right in the face of. How can that happen, that transformation? Of course, it starts with our own behavior. On the issue of food waste, it's simple. We buy what we need and we eat what we buy. We don't end up spending our money on stuff that we don't no longer need. We ensure that when we go into shops, if we have to go into shops at all, we go in shops, we buy what we need. And when we get it home, that stuff is our moral responsibility to use up every morsel of it. And once you've understood that fundamental principle, you don't need me to give you recipes about how to make smoothies out of black bananas. You just know that that food is sacred. It's an important bond between you and the planet and you and your fellow humans. The second tier, of course, is that we vote with our pounds every day, our dollars, our euros, our lira, whatever we're spending. that is our power, if you like, as consumers, and where we spend that money, who we give that money to. Are we going to give it to a supermarket that is exploiting African farmers and not paying them when they cancel orders at the last minute? I don't know a single person who thinks that's the right thing to do. So find out about our supply chains. There is increasing transparency, and give your money to companies that you know are acting in a responsible way towards planet Earth and to their fellow humans. And then the third, and I would argue the most important tier of activism is around government policy, because without regulation, companies will continue to act in ways that generate profit, but also create environmental and social degradation. And the kinds of policy I'm talking about are both specific issues to do with food waste. So, for example, the United Kingdom was due to do a consultation. It's been postponed because of the pandemic, but it is genuinely now considering bringing in mandatory reporting of food waste for big companies. So those companies will have to say how much food they waste on an annual basis and let everyone see that. That kind of policy can really help on a practical way to tackle the problem of food waste. As an entrepreneur dealing in food that would otherwise be wasted, I want to know where the food is being wasted. I want to see where I should invest in the solutions. If I'm a member of the public, I want to see which supermarkets waste more and which ones waste less, so that I can choose where to spend my money. And so that kind of policy is very important. But the United Kingdom, for example, passed a groundbreaking law in 2013, the Groceries Co-Adjudicator Act. It made it illegal for supermarkets to cancel orders at the last minute, with the result that farmers and factories wasted food at their cost. Now, that is an imperfect law, but it was really transformative. So these specific policies have a role to play, but there are bigger and more structural ones that governments need to get a grip with. And the first of those is farm subsidies. $700 billion of public money are spent globally every year on farm subsidies. At present, according to the Food and Land Use Coalition's recent study, only 1% of those subsidies are spent on environmental beneficial farming. We need to flip that and make it 99% supporting environmentally beneficial farming, because the food system, as I've said, is one of our biggest problems. But I believe the food system could be the most powerful tool in solving the environmental crisis we're in so many different ways. I believe that farmland is the biggest opportunity for getting carbon out of the atmosphere and back into the ground. Indeed, that is what plants have been doing for billions of years. They suck carbon out of the atmosphere and they stick it in the ground. And that is what we've depleted over the last several decades through bad farming practices, and good farming practices can put it back on an annual basis. We suck carbon out of the atmosphere, let's stick it in the ground. Carbon sequestration in agricultural soils being subsidized by those massive budgets that the public are currently paying taxes towards. I think that is a colossal opportunity. We know how to do farming in a way that creates habitat for wildlife rather than destroys it. Now, I, on my own farm, have a huge effort to increase wildflowers and habitat for birds and insects. It's amazing what you can do with farmland for wildlife. We know how to do farming in a way that can put water back into the water table instead of extracting it. Indeed, we know how to do farming in a way that can create sustainable, environmentally friendly, and very importantly, healthy food for everyone. And using the farm system, the food system, as our way of tackling those environmental problems is, I think, our biggest opportunity. I will round off by just saying two more things. The first is that I think all of these issues can be looked at through the lens of my favorite word, companion. You have the same word in Spanish, compañero, in Portuguese, in French, it's copain. And this, of course, etymologically comes from Latin. Com is with and pan is bread. And a companion, compañero, is someone you share food with. And indeed, the sharing of food is a universal human behavior found in absolutely every culture in the world. The use of the sharing of food to build friendship. to build society, companionship. Indeed, it's not even exclusively human behavior. This is a universally great ape behavior. If you look at our closest animal relatives, the bonobos, my favorite animals, they will proactively go and find other bonobos to share their surplus food with. And very interestingly, they will choose a stranger in preference over a friend to share their surplus food with. That may seem counterintuitive, but what they're doing is turning surplus food into social capital to make new friends. Now, we humans, if we can reappraise the food system through the lens of companionship and say, look, the wasting a third of our food every year is obviously nonsense, but look at that as an opportunity to make more friends, to ensure both on a local level, domestically, I give my leftovers or eat my daughter's leftovers or whatever, but also on a more geopolitical level, let's ensure that everyone has enough food and to share the resources that we have rather than to waste them. That lens of companionship, I think, can speak to us very deeply, deep within us. We have a desire to share food and make friends. And currently that spirit of companionship has been broken within a profit-driven food system. And we need to restore that sense of companionship to our own food behaviors, good companionship with our fellow humans, good companionship with planet Earth. And through that, our own behavior, our relationship with the businesses that provide us food, and the representatives in government that create policies supposedly for our long-term benefit, can use that spirit of companionship to reform what is currently a really destructive system and turn it into our most powerful ally. And just to round it off with that second thing, I think we need to do that from an international perspective, indeed not even international, from a global perspective. The nation state and the way that we've carved up the world into these separate political entities, and then allow multinational corporations to play these nation states against each other through driving down taxes, creating tax havens. This kind of policy, finding the place with the lowest environmental and social regulation, that nation state system stands in the way of the global solutions we need to build. And therefore our thinking needs to be first and foremost global. We need global representation, global governance, but even before that, we need global culture. We need to think of ourselves as individuals within a planetary species with planetary problems to solve.
So how does this relate to your feedback project? Could you please tell us a bit about it?
Okay, so just to clarify, I founded the charity Feedback. It grew out of many campaigns against food waste and other environmental food problems that I had been working on for many years. I am no longer within the organization. Me and my co-founder, Nikki, in 2017, both decided it was time to start new things and go off to other parts of the world. And we hired a brilliant new director, Karina Millstone, who now runs that charity Feedback, and has taken Feedback in new and exciting directions, tackling not just the problem of food waste, but also looking at how, for example, the industrial meat production system is being driven in a direction that is both environmentally calamitous, totally immoral in its treatment of animals, and indeed financially very, very risky for any individual or financial entity that's invested in that industry. This is a suicidal industry, you could almost say. So Feedback is now doing fantastic work across the board, but I am no longer involved directly in the charity. Of course, I'm routinely in touch with them and I'm the biggest fan of the organization, but I do want to clarify that I'm not a representative of Feedback anymore. But what was it setting out to do? Well, it was setting out to challenge that fundamental paradigm within the food system, this productionist paradigm, stand in the way of the environmental exploitation that flows from that profit-driven food system, and to stand up for people who are being exploited for it. Of course, food waste was where we started. We kicked off a global tidal wave of enthusiasm. We launched national campaigns against food waste in 50 cities around the world. We came to Spain, where we did a Feeding the 5,000 in Barcelona, the Gran Dinar, with our wonderful friends in Catalonia, both the entrepreneurs who were recovering surplus food and misshapen food from farms, but also the charities working to collect surplus food and donate it to people who needed it. I traveled across Latin America looking at how farmers in those countries were being exploited and I think mistreated by Western supermarkets, as I've already mentioned. So we went around the world, putting together coalitions of organizations, chefs, citizen organizations, raising public awareness and really trying to drive this up the agenda. In Peru, we organized a disco supa in Lima, involving the wonderful chef Palmiro Acampo, who took on the championing of food waste in Peru and created a whole school to help chefs understand how to tackle food waste, helping disadvantaged people get trained into the culinary trade by using surplus food, teaming up with the food bank of Peru and ensuring the supermarkets would put under pressure, encouraging policymakers to pass laws that were going to be favorable towards food donation rather than food redistribution. You know, we really took this agenda to every corner of the earth and ignited, I think, a tidal wave of activity around the issue of food waste. And as I say, since then, the energy has been taken into many other quarters, into the totally ridiculous creation, farming and subsidizing of sugar production in Europe. This is a product we all eat too much of in Europe. Why are we spending public money propping up the industry that's growing this kind of totally unhealthy food product and then encouraging big companies like Coca-Cola to spend millions of marketing dollars encouraging young children to eat way more of it than they should? And of course, its environmental impact is colossal. The soil erosion that happens on sugar beet farms is massive. So feedback goes after these food-related issues from a fearless perspective of speaking truth to power, rabble-rousing, creating an uprising of citizen action around it, taking responsibility both for our own behavior, but also challenging industry and government to play their role in urgently transforming the food system.
And what about now? What are some of your current projects? What are you working on?
Oh, well, I also founded a company called Toast Ale, which does a number of things, but its fundamental role is to find surplus bread that the industry is going to waste, but which is perfectly fit for human consumption. And we upcycle that bread into beer. And this is, in fact, the ancient origins of beer. The ancient Sumerians and Babylonians created beer as a way of using up grains and bread that would otherwise be wasted. Essentially, you're fermenting those perishable products into a long shelf life, delicious and highly calorific drink. The inebriation that results is a happy side effect of beer production. And what we do is we recover bread from the industry that would otherwise be wasted, turn it into delicious craft ale. We win prizes purely on taste testing. It's not just because we're an environmental organization, but it actually is just damn good beer. And then we sell that. Well, we've been brewing in several different countries, and we give our profits to feedback and to other charities working in an aligned field. So that was a project I started in 2015, 2016, and as I say, has now brewed millions of slices of bread, and Toast Ale is becoming a really, really respected and favorite brand amongst sustainable brands, delivering just the kind of transformative changes that we need. So it's using much less land and water and other resources that other beer companies would, and still producing as good. It's like the equivalent of a car that uses a third less fuel than any other, but drives just as well and is just as comfortable and great to drive. That's the equivalent that Toast Ale is in the beer world. I more recently have also been very much focused on, particularly since lockdown and my kind of usual job of going around the world giving talks and engaging audiences in environmental initiatives is now done much more easily in this way. On my phone, I can sort of be doing podcasts whilst weeding the vegetables in my polytunnel. It's very convenient. And this has allowed me to turn my mind to the land where I live. And I'm now engaged in a land restoration project, a river pollution prevention group that I've started. We are in the planning stages of reintroducing some extinct species, rewilding the valley where I live, with trying to reintroduce water voles and eventually beavers back into the valley. I'm doing conservation grazing with a revolutionary new piece of technology, which is a collar around the cow's neck that tells them where they can go and when they can't go. So it's like an invisible electric fence, and this allows the grazing animals to roam freely over the landscape without the need to put up expensive and ecologically damaging fencing. It's a way, I think, of farming that will really change the way in which we can do conservation at the same time as producing food. So these are really wonderful land-based projects that I've always been involved in, but I've had increasing amount of time to dedicate to. At the same time, I am obviously focused on my external campaigning, and as you will have heard in the course of this interview, my mind goes more and more towards how do we create those global governance and global citizenry platforms that we need to break out of the tragedy of the commons that is currently being perpetuated by the nation state. So those are my kind of activities and interests, and obviously, like everyone else, lockdown has just made turned everything on its head. But for me, at least, not entirely in bad ways.